This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I wasn't going to do this. I was going to weigh in on the freedom of movement, the return of freedom of movement, although obviously it's not freedom of movement, and neither is it liberty of motion, but it is an extension to European Union citizens, a potential extension to European Union citizens of for the under 30s, if you like, that the young Europeans could come and live and work in Britain as part of a wider reset of relations. But I mean, maybe we'll talk about that a little later. I'm not sure. It's Thursday, of course, so Mystery Hour's on the way at 12. But it's a weird one, doing this job when you're a parent. I've had a child in both cohorts this year, the A-level cohort and the GCSE cohort. And this morning we've had the second round of results, and this is their story, not mine. So I'll leave it at describing myself as an extremely proud father on both mornings. But I remember Nick saying something many years ago, long before, I don't know if I was I must have been a dad, but Nick Ferrari's kids are older than mine. His sons are quite a bit older than mine. And I remember him approaching the subject of phone-ins on the morning of exam results with the knowledge that there will be people listening who haven't done very well or haven't done as well as they hoped. And of course, there will be the parents listening. And that really stayed with me. And as a result of that, in many ways, I've stayed away from the subject entirely. I haven't sort of thrown open the phone lines to A-level results day or GCSE results day. I've sort of tiptoed around the subject for that reason. I don't think it's helpful to weigh in with don't worry about it, I did fine. We're incredibly privileged people like Jeremy Clarkson and the 4th Baron Bethel tweet about how, they didn't do very well in their public exams and it hasn't done them any harm. The 4th Baron Bethel, I kid you not, claimed that it was what taught him how to hustle. The reason I keep saying the 4th Baron Bethel is because if you're the 4th Baron Bethel, if you are the fourth iteration of a hereditary barony, then your understanding of what hustling involves in the summer that you left Harrow, your understanding of what hustling involves is probably a little bit different to the average Brit. Mine would be closer to his, given the sort of school that I went to. But even my understanding of what hustling would involve, given that my father was not a baron, and nor am I, nor will I ever be, again, there's probably a slight difference. We may get onto elements of this conversation in the next hour because the rather splendid James Graham, playwright, scriptwriter and all-round genius, has given a speech about class in the television industry in particular, which looks at what working class means in the context of advancement. And that's kind of the point I'm making. When Jeremy Clarkson says, I got rubbish A-levels and look how rich I am, he doesn't mention that he was the son of wealthy people. He went to public school. He had all of the advantages that can be bestowed upon a young man in modern Britain, just as I did. So our achievements must be mitigated by our advantages and our privileges, but some people are very uncomfortable being reminded of that. People without those advantages and without those privileges, of course, have very different experiences, which we'll look at in the next hour. But the bit from yesterday that struck me, it was an odd moment, actually. I don't know if you were listening. If you weren't, we touched on Kirsty Allsop and her revelation on social media. Kirsty Allsop, the TV presenter, and her sort of revelation, if that's the right word, on social media, that her 15-year-old son had been travelling around Europe with a 16-year-old friend and no adults. And some people, I think mostly idiots, and I use that word affectionately, I think mostly idiots got their knickers in a right old twist about this. Having never met the kid and having no personal experience of his maturity or otherwise, they felt they knew more about the suitability of letting him tootle around continental Europe with a pal than his own mother did. I liked the story for two reasons. I liked it because it was thought-provoking. Why would anybody get cross with another mother's judgment of her own child who they've never met? It was a weird one, right? And it wasn't just the sort of social media age that we live in where you've got to have a pungent opinion about everything. And when we started unpicking that, you couldn't help seeing the green-eyed monster, as Iago famously called it in Othello. the green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds on, because you were either envious of Kirsty Allsop's courage in letting her child do something that you wouldn't let your child do, but you're too embarrassed to admit that you're paranoid, or you were jealous of Kirsty Allsop having a 15-year-old who would be capable of travelling around Europe on his own or with one mate, because you know that your wonderful 15-year-old child struggles to go to the fish and chip shop unaccompanied as a consequence of what? And that's what I've been pondering since we finished that conversation yesterday. As a consequence of what? Because it began with the news that more than a quarter of teachers say that pupils withdrew from their GCSE exams this year because of anxiety. 65% said that Year 11 students had failed to attend school at some point owing to exam anxiety. 3/4 of teachers sought alternative exam arrangements for their pupils to ease stress levels. Another story today in the Telegraph, again perhaps a bit unhelpful in the way that the 1 in 3 pupils are set to fail GCSE English and Maths. The problem is it's not an opinion, it's just counting. An analysis in the Telegraph today shows that this year's GCSE cohort were almost twice as likely to be persistently absent in the run-up to their exams than pupils taking them in the year before the pandemic. Unfortunately, the Daily Telegraph elects to use the word truancy in their headlines. Now, there may be some young people who are not attending school during this incredibly important and formative period who quite easily could be, but would just rather not. My children are the rare occasions these days when I manage to amuse them. They are deeply amused by the prospect of trying to play truant from a boarding school. It's quite a difficult proposition when your school is also your home for the duration of the academic term. But I did manage to skive a few lessons in the relevant years, despite the fact that my bedroom was on the same campus as my classroom. And I don't know, that's the problem, isn't it, with this sort of statistic? One poll finds the number of children that have been absent due to anxiety, and another finds the number of children who have been absent and attributes it immediately to truancy. 11 minutes after 10 is the time. So what I'd like to know is why this particular cohort is so anxious. And we can do it in two ways. We can do it from the personal, or we can do it from the meta, from the overview. I think that perhaps the children who've just taken their GCSEs are the most sinned against generation in living memory. And sinned against isn't fair. The most unlucky generation in living memory. These would be the young people whose first year at secondary school was blighted by lockdown, wouldn't it? So imagine starting at secondary school without a big bunch of mates from primary school. So you would be going through all of the processes of socializing. You'd be learning the lessons. I mean, what's the difference between your final year at primary school and your first year at secondary school? It's absolutely huge, right? It's a point at which sometimes children really change. They become embarrassed by their intelligence sometimes, or they become detached from their social groups. You go to a different school from your mates from home. All sorts of things can happen in that first year at secondary school. And for this lot, it didn't happen. They weren't there a lot, and when they were there, they were living in circumstances that were really difficult and really different from anything that has gone before. There were privations of every kind during lockdown, during the coronavirus crisis. But I think that's a good word. Thank you, Callum. Embattled, the most embattled generation, the most embattled classroom cohort that I think we've ever had. And of course, it's not helped by the temptation of older people to insist that younger people these days have got everything so much easier than we had it. But I think that is why this particular cohort is struggling so much with anxiety. And I want to know whether you agree. 0345 6060 973. I also I also want to really grasp the nettle on this one. And I can't, unfortunately. I mean, I don't, since they started at secondary school, I don't really use my children as trampolines into topics for us to discuss together, because their stories are not my stories to tell. But I mean, I can tell you that I don't have the correct personal experience to comment on how much adult anxiety is feeding into teenage anxiety. This was why the Kirsty Allsop story worked so well alongside the GCSE anxiety story yesterday, because the parents who were going, God, there's no earthly way my 15-year-old could do that, are also the parents going, oh my God, I can't believe Kirsty Allsop lets her child do that. And quite often, when you've got a pungent opinion that involves being negative about somebody else, it speaks to, there's a bit of projection involved, or it speaks to a deeper unacknowledged bitterness or unhappiness inside the person with the unpleasant pungent opinion. And on this case, it would be, my child is not emotionally ready to do something like that because of, for want of a better word, there may be different words, better words, for want of anxiety. And what you have there is a very real possibility that it is mum and or dad who have somehow imbued their child with anxiety. So why would 16-year-olds today be more anxious than any 16-year-olds in the last 40 years, let's say, or more? Actually, it doesn't work, does it? 60 years. I suppose wartime aside, although for the huge majority of children growing up during the Second World War, unless they were in big cities, their lives would be we have a concept, don't we, of everybody being affected by the Blitz. In many ways, being evacuated was probably emotionally more traumatic for many young people than being in the Blitz itself. But war aside, obviously, why would this generation, why did these 16-year-olds suffer so much from anxiety? And how much of it is down to paranoid parents? And who can answer that last question? Because we can all speculate upon other people's families, can't we? We can all say, oh, yeah, I know someone and she's a right old helicopter parent. She doesn't let her children do anything on their own. But you don't know what's going on behind closed doors. What you really need is someone listening to this now to say, do you know what? I think it's my fault that my child is not. Well, I think it's my fault either that my child is very anxious, or I think it's my child. I think the reason why my child couldn't possibly undertake a big exercise in independence is because I have passed on my anxiety to them. What do you reckon? So there's the why of it and the what of it. Why are this generation so plagued by anxiety? 0345 6060 973. And how much of it is actually mum and dad's fault? You wouldn't blame the parents. It used to be a very popular refrain whenever you were talking about youthful issues or youthful problems. In fact, it struck me the other day that when black children were doing worse in school, blame the parents was the constant refrain. But now that that's not the case, it's generally white working class children, and we'll talk in the next hour about what that phrase actually means, who are performing worse in school, and suddenly it's a result of systemic bias or unfairness, or, I haven't heard this phrase yet, but we probably will do soon, two-tier education, or of course it's because there's so many children in the classroom who are bilingual. Funny how that particular world turns, but let's not get distracted. What's going on? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need.
James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 10 is the time. Good luck. It's probably too late for good luck. I should have said good luck yesterday. If your GCSE results have come out today, or if your children's GCSE results have come out today, I hope you've got what you wanted. I hope you've got what you needed. And I'm sorry if you haven't. It's a tough old day to get through, week, month. But it will pass. Everything passes. This too will pass. I think that's from the Bible. But it's no comfort to you today feeling like your world has fallen in. I promise you it hasn't. But I also acknowledge that it feels like it has, and that is just not fair. I'm really sorry that you're going through that. But why do we think that your generation in particular suffers from anxiety in a way that previous and hopefully future generations do not, or indeed will not? Let's start in Barnet. Arwad's in Barnet. Arwad, what would you like to say?
Hiya, this very, very strongly resonates with me. So if I'm emotional, I do apologise.
Take your time. Don't apologise for being emotional.
I took my GCSEs 3 and 4 years ago, in 2020 and 2021.
Okay.
The 2 years where we got teacher-assessed results. I ended up failing half of them. At the time, I had severe anxiety. I had essentially had to be taken away to hospital because my mental well-being had gotten so bad. And I just got the help after the incident had happened. I'd finally got the help I'd needed for so long.
Okay.
And I was able, my wonderful teachers were able to do so much for me. They were able to help me so strongly, even though at the time I went to a little performance school,
yes.
And I managed to get a place at a Russell Group university. And I ended up performing at the top of my class in coursework and other modules.
What do you think? And everybody's different. No two people who've been through anything like what you've been through are the same. But what, generationally speaking, what pressures do you think you were exposed to that you, if you were a different age, if you were 5 years older, you wouldn't have been exposed to?
I mean, necessarily, you just don't have that massive disruption to your education. 2 years of full-time education were essentially...
So, terrible phone line, Arwad, so I'm not going to be able to talk to you for as long as I want to, and forgive me if I sound a bit... If I sound terse as a consequence of that. But everybody went through the same experience. What were the pressures that you found intolerable?
I mean, 2 years was swept away.
Yeah.
Just swept away clean, and... For some people, a lot of people did really well, but a lot of people who particularly deserved their grades, didn't do as well. So you essentially had a case where people who, let's say, would have performed under certain conditions really well, but under A-level conditions not as well, and people who would have performed under X conditions well, and other conditions not well, would have essentially found themselves in in places where they essentially wouldn't have performed at their best in.
Yes, I think you're right, and I apologise not keeping you on for a little bit longer, but the phone line's quite glitchy, and if I were keeping Arwad on a little longer, I'd ask, how let down do you feel by society or by your elders if you're in this cohort? And let's take it back to his group, the people that sat their exams in the years where schooling was disrupted. Sounds euphemistic, doesn't it? How let down I mean, how helpful can it really be if you haven't done your GCSEs or you haven't sat all your GCSEs this year due to anxiety, to open up the Daily Telegraph website and see it all attributed to truancy? Jacob's in Durham. Jacob, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I'm feeling quite nervous.
It's only me.
So I was... I did very well in secondary school up to GCSEs, but around there, when exam pressures began to be applied,
yes,
I even in the first year, I was feeling sick with anxiety on a daily basis from the moment I woke up.
The first year of your GCSE courses?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Can we pause and wonder why? Do we know? Have we given much thought to why? Why would you? I mean, I want to stress, when you say you feel sick with anxiety, this is not normal. This isn't just the normal, I don't want to go to school today, I'd rather stay at home and watch telly, or this is almost a destabilising level of anxiety. Do we know why? Do we know where it came from?
I think it's quite a complicated combination of factors. I remember thinking specifically about a teacher I had who was just very sort of shouty and unpredictable, and I would dread his lessons in particular.
Right.
But overall, just it was a horrid environment from more or less every perspective. Okay. It was there were, I have had issues with bullying, but I think that arguably the teachers play as much of a role in it as anybody, because there's this very adversarial approach.
Were you at private school?
No.
Okay.
I was I don't know if I want to.
No, don't go. No, you don't do anything you're uncomfortable with. Because you draw an immediate contrast with Arwad, who had a terrible time during his GCSEs, and then he used that phrase, my teachers held me close, my teachers held me up, and as a consequence of that, 2 years later, he smashed his A-levels and got into a very good university. So we can't generalise about teachers, because there's two completely contrasting experiences, but this is your experience, and I mean, it was as if the expectations of you were unhealthy even.
Yeah, it's not an issue with teachers. I think it's an issue with the culture.
Yeah.
Because you talk to the teachers individually, and they're very nice, but then you sort of put that in the context of wider school environment, and there's a lot of pressure, and they're quite unforgiving, and it doesn't seem like there's an opportunity to discuss why you're having difficulties. It seems that you are either perfectly on track or you're not.
So how bad did it get?
Oh God. I left year 12. I got an okay crop of GCSE results.
Yes.
And I left, but I did underperform, I think. And I left year 12 with sort of thoughts of wanting to end my own life.
Oh my.
In Easter.
Right.
I've since been diagnosed with ADHD and autism.
Yes.
And
was that a relief?
Oh, I mean, it's tough, because it, in one sense, yes, because you can now, I can now say to people, hey, look, I have this piece of paper that says I have the thing.
Yes.
Can I have the support for it? But on the other hand, it's very tricky to sort of.
I understand what you're saying. What's the word? Like, what's the opposite of neurodivergent? What's the correct word to use?
Neurotypical.
So being neurotypical generally speaks to an easier life.
I would say so.
Yeah, I think that's what you're alluding to. So it's good to know. It's good to give it a name, to know why. You find some things more difficult than other people do, but equally, it would also be nice to not find things more difficult than some people do.
Yeah. It's exactly that. And I love my neurodivergence and how what it it's a part of me. But I think it's in the context of an exam. It's very. I remember. I walked into my first GCSE mock, and a girl fainted onto my desk.
Wow!
And I actually spoke with my head of year about having thoughts of wanting to end my own life, and she said that a quarter of all students had talked to her about that.
This is the trick. The tricky bit that you've identified, having someone faint on your desk is going to put you slightly off your stroke, isn't it? When you're about to start writing your exams. No one knows. What you need, oddly, is I need to have been 18 when I was 18 and 18 when you were 18. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to make meaningful, or to provide meaningful answers to the questions about why things seem to be so much harder. For your generation than they were for mine. How much of it do you think, briefly, because we're going to run out of time, but how much of it do you think is parental? And I don't want you to be disloyal or say anything you're uncomfortable saying, but I do wonder how many people looking back, maybe from a slightly older perspective than yours, think that some of their anxiety may have been brought to school from home.
I think my parents were very supportive.
Yes.
But it's, that's not to say that they were perfect.
No parents are perfect.
There was it's even things that you might not notice.
Yes.
As parents, sort of So, if you picture me, I was coming home from school every day. I finally escaped.
Yeah.
And the very first question is, how was school?
Yeah.
How is this? And it seemed as though every single time we wanted to talk, because they were aware that I was having problems, but it would always come up as, how's school? How can we help?
Yeah.
And it was the one thing that I just really didn't
You wanted
want
to switch off. You wanted to shut that door for the evening, and they wanted to open it because they thought they could only fix the things on the other side of that door by going through it with you every evening.
Yeah, and I would get very angry. I would switch off. It didn't lead to any helpful discussion because they just felt like another sort of authority to appease.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. In fact, that's a really powerful call that I can tell from my inbox has moved a lot of people and also helped understand some of these issues. And I'm going to mention briefly, if I may, and I hope Jacob doesn't mind, an article written in the Times by Matthew Parris this week that essentially poo-pooed the existence of diagnoses like ADHD and autism. It was one of the most and I've historically been a great admirer of Matthew Parris. He's been on my podcast, which, as you know, I only invite people onto the Full Disclosure podcast if I relish the idea of spending an hour with them, enjoying an hour of their company. It was one of the most unpleasant pieces of journalism I've ever read in a mainstream newspaper. And if I was shy about saying that, then listening to people like Jacob describe their lives and their experiences removes the final scintilla of shyness from my mind. It's a hideous position to adopt, absolutely hideous, and it's not unpopular. 10:31 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:34 is the time. Should we do an Idiot's Corner? We haven't done. Maybe that's a bit unkind. David's in Peterborough. He goes, is this LBC presenter a spokesperson for the woke and snowflake generation? David, mate, I'll tell you what this LBC presenter is. He is passionately committed to the idea of stopping people who are young today growing up to be as bitter and unhappy as you are. And it's a steep, steep mountain, but it's not too late for you. Empathy, compassion, understanding, listening, all of those things will make you not only a happier person, but if you have other people in your life, it will make you a better partner, a better parent, and a better son. And if you want to use words like snowflake and woke, that's fine, but they are just synonyms used by people who don't currently have the capacity for compassion or empathy or concern to describe people who do. And those people who put those words in your vocabulary, they are not your friends. 10:35 is the time. So not Idiot's Corner. I like to think that Idiot's Corner is for the more irredeemable cases as opposed to the people for whom a little bit of encouragement could still provide progress. Dan's in Nottingham. Back on this anxiety question. Dan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
So I grew up in a unstable household when I was younger. Mum was in abusive relationships and so on. Although I had a happy enough childhood.
Yeah.
Things that wouldn't have come out at school, looking in wouldn't have been an issue because I seemed like a happy child.
Yes.
And so that was that. I think
were
that
you
was
masking, do you think? I mean, were you putting a brave face on things, or were you actually happier at school than you were sometimes at home?
I think it was more to the fact that I didn't want to let my mum down, so I never kind of complained or made anything of it.
She had enough on her plate without you adding to it, you felt,
yes,
as a child.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a reversal of the natural order, but a perfectly normal way to behave.
Yeah, and she had no interest in, my education. She never asked me about school or homework or anything like that, and I, in turn, had no interest in school because I think I probably had undiagnosed. Well, I am dyslexic, so
sure.
At that time I was probably severely dyslexic. Basically went through school wondering why I couldn't do the work that everybody else was doing. This was the mid-90s, so nothing was ever diagnosed. You kind of just see yourself as being a bit stupid. And when it came to exams, I didn't pass any of my exams. I walked into the exam room, looked at the papers, and they just didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't read them properly. If I could read them, I didn't have enough time to make sense of what I was reading.
So this is as a consequence of your dyslexia, and yet for people who aren't dyslexic, it sounds like an anxiety dream.
Yes, yeah. I think it was dyslexia which then which obviously I didn't know about at that time. It wasn't even spoke about in the early mid-90s. So that probably turned into anxiety because I just thought I was stupid. And so I went into the exams thinking I'm stupid, couldn't read the papers, couldn't, make sense of them, and, ultimately failed everything. And then after leaving school, it was kind of my choice of employment was either a sandwich factory, local sandwich factory, or joining the army. So I joined the army, which my mum was really supportive of. And I think that taught me some resilience. It also taught me...
It would do, wouldn't it? You'd hope so.
Yes.
How much of your experience do you think is generational and how much do you think is very personal? Because if we were trying to pin down why anxiety, and you're older than the current cohort of GCSE students, I think you've got a sister, haven't you? You look at her experience and wonder why her generation is going to be quite different from how yours was. What would you point at?
I think I point with my sister. A lot of her anxiety, I think, comes from her mobile phone. She seems to spend, like probably most teenagers, the majority of her time.
See, that for you wasn't a thing. It's information overload, isn't it? Even if you're not looking at entirely negative things, you're just not evolved. Is a good word to use. Is a word that Emma uses, to be on it 24/7, bathed in a constant blue light, drowned in audio. We're literally not evolved to be doing that, and everybody is. Almost everybody is.
Yes, yeah. I do find looking at, especially my sister's generation. She's now 17.
Yes.
I think that it seems to be, and her friends too, seems to lack confidence socially in real life social situations,
because they live so much of their social life online, and because the lockdowns and the school closures robbed them of the period where they would have developed some of the skills that are now noticeably absent, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot less real life interaction now, because everything,
Do you think it's going to swing back, Dan? Do you think it's going to swing back?
Don't think so. No, not. Well, I can't see it because everything. We're becoming a society where we have less and less human interaction with people that we don't know.
Yeah.
Whereas
and more human interaction with deeply unhealthy influences on social media. Not just interacting with your own friends, which means you're not interacting in real life, as it were, but also, of course, falling down these hate-filled rabbit holes that are causing so much damage to so many people at the moment.
Yeah. And I think my generation is you would have to go somewhere, at least to speak to somebody, to fill out a form, or you'd have to go to the shop and you speak to people in shops, or you'd have to go to... And
these are all things that younger people find quite daunting now. I was always a weird one with the phone, Dan. I don't know. So where are you? Sort of mid-90s you were at school. So mobile phones weren't everywhere when you were young, when you were primary school.
No, I think I was...
Landline.
17.
Yeah, but I mean, I was at university by the time mobile phones started popping up all over, because I used to be terrified of the landline. I just couldn't do it. It was just so weird, and most people found it the easiest thing in the world. But for the younger generation, the things that they find daunting are almost impossible for us to get our heads around. That's why it's interesting that you've got a younger sister who you can make these comparisons with. I think that would help everyone, rather than thinking that things must be a bit like they were when we were that age, but just not entirely identical. And I've noticed something as well while I was listening to Dan, and it's something you need to help me with. Is if it's a sort of obvious answer when we're talking about this to say, "Oh, it's smartphones, James," and if that's all you've got to say, then it's not that interesting. So I've been subconsciously trained in the years that I've doing this job. I don't know if I should tell you this, but you've probably noticed to be a bit impatient with people that say the things that I'm expecting to hear. And that's the opposite of helpful in the context of this conversation, because we actually don't talk about it enough. Sometimes the bleeding obvious is the thing that needs to be talked about more. So Dan drawing attention to the constant drip of social media. And you don't have to be looking at unhealthy or harmful websites. You don't have to be looking at disgusting stuff. You could just only be interacting with people that you know. But the level of interaction is so unrelenting. Unrelenting is a great word. Unremitting is another one. It's so unrelenting, it's so unremitting that I don't think my generation can imagine what it would be like to be going through that in your formative years. And of course, it affects our generations as well. Every generation is affected by this. Thank you, Dan. 10:43 is the time. Let's go to John, who's on the Wirral. John, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, I work at a primary school, a large primary school. I'm a deputy head there.
Yeah.
And just on your point about anxiety, affecting attendance, education, we've seen a big spike post-COVID in the number of children who have anxiety presenting at school, reluctant to come in.
And it hasn't retreated as much as we would have expected as things return to normal.
No.
That's
and I think it's one of those classic things where are we more aware of it, or is there more of it? I think it's a mixture of the two, really. I think we're much more aware of children with anxiety. And we cater for it. We're really lucky where I work. We've got a fantastic team of pastoral teachers who are there on the gate every day, greeting children who are reluctant to come in or have anxiety, make sure they're settled and ready to learn. So, but the cynical side of me almost says the more we cater for it, the worse it's going to get in some ways.
Aye.
It's hard. We see some children who are really reluctant to come in, and the parents, I think, going back to what you were saying before about sometimes parents can imbue children with their own anxieties, and we support parents too, which is obviously something that we should do. But, I've seen children who are super reluctant to come in with their parents at the gate. Once they're in the routine of school, anxiety abates.
Yeah.
And they're happy and they're learning. And then that brings you to a point where you may have a conversation with a family that say, we don't want our child to come in because they're so anxious, they're terrified to come in. We might say they present differently within the classroom, they're happy, they're engaging with their friends, they're engaging with the teacher. And then masking is discussed.
Right.
And I think some children do mask. They go home, they've been fine in school all day, but when they get back home, they'll go off like a bottle.
They've seemed fine in school.
They've seemed fine, yeah. They'll go off like a bottle of pop because home is their safe place, which is where they can, they can decompress.
Yes, of course.
If you like. But I also feel everybody deals with certain levels of anxiety, and it's important that we support children to come in as much as possible.
You're knocking at the door that we explored, I think, earlier this week or late last week, as a professor made some comments which were a bit similar to yours. They could have been misconstrued, but there is a point at which what you would call loving encouragement has a role to play, as opposed to loving accommodation. And I don't know where. I'd tell you something that will make you laugh. Older than the children that you look after.
Yeah.
But a pal of mine whose child is doing brilliantly now, at second year at university, but had a miserable time during GCSEs and missed a lot of school and was in a proper state. And about the end of her first term back from university, she said to her dad, "I can't believe you let me stay off school like that." And he was like, "What do you mean I let you stay off school?" You were telling me the worst things were going to happen if you had to go to school. You couldn't, you were almost emotionally paralyzed. But looking back, she somehow felt that he could have been a bit more, what was the word I used? A bit more lovingly encouraging as opposed to lovingly accommodating. And that is, in a way, the hardest one of all, because you get it wrong, everything gets worse.
Yeah, and it's we feel for the children who are missing out on those days in school, and we know it's difficult for them to come in, but it's that, I'd love to know more about masking, because I don't know if masking is the wrong term. If it's
my understanding of it is
better phrase.
My understanding of it is specific to autism. I'm sure it has wider applications, but it's when you know that you're neurodivergent and you want to present as being neurotypical, so you behave it, and the exhaustion involved in that. I don't know whether it's a helpful analogy, but trying to speak with an accent all day that's not yours Do you know what I mean? Just trying to, if I'm trying to talk with a Scouse accent all day long, and every time I slipped a bit, I'd feel, oh no, I'd feel shame or I'd feel embarrassed. I think that's a good way of understanding it, but I don't know what the applications are of that phenomenon outside of that sphere. They must be real. I presume they're real. John, thank you. And that's it. I mean, the teachers got so much to deal with already, and then this adds a new dimension to traditional responsibilities. The question of whether things will swing back interests you, I can tell. Natasja references friends in the Netherlands where family will often put their phones away, spend time actually socialising. There are phone-free cafes, phone-free parks gaining popularity in that generation. Sam Smith's pubs in London often try to have a phone-free section. Or there's one up on Marylebone High Street I wandered in the other day, and it just said, you're not allowed to use your phones in here. And I thought, crikey. And it wasn't in a cool way. Like, you know, I think at Soho House they probably still do have a ban on using your mobile phones because they didn't want Dom Jolly sitting in the corner going, I'm in Soho House. The pubs are doing it. It actually said on this little note in the pub that they were trying to encourage conversation. The reasons why you used to go to a pub listen, I'm aware of all the dangers of alcohol and the rest of it, but pubs are one of the few places, pubs and parks, I suppose, where you would be likely to talk to people in some depth about to whom you didn't already know. How chilling would that prospect be to the generations that we're discussing this morning? I just want you to go into that room over there and start a conversation with someone you've never met before. Could you just go and sit down on that bench and start talking to the person sitting next to you? Listen, I have nothing but sympathy for what these young people have been through, but I'm fairly confident that for most of that generation, that would be a chilling prospect. Many, not most, many of that generation, this would be quite a chilling prospect, which is all pertinent to the broader conversation that we're having today. I think many of you are telling me that masking can be very, very commonplace, not just in the context of autism, but any neurodivergence. It is 10:49.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:51 is the time. I do enjoy these conversations, which is an odd word to use because we're describing difficulty, but of course. You know what they say, a problem shared is a problem halved. And I can tell you, but from the state of my switchboard and my inbox, that there are families up and down the country that are dealing with these things in secret, in private. In fact, I don't know how many people you can see now where you're sitting, where you're listening to me. Obviously, if you're in the bath, this is unlikely to work. But if you've got headphones in at work and you look around that room, there will be someone in that room dealing with what we are talking about today, dealing with either the repercussions of their own situation or worrying about their children's. Be people who are putting brave faces on up and down the country about their children's GCSE results, while screaming inside, not necessarily about the results, but about the struggle to get to that point. And we don't talk about it enough. Which is why I am short of patience when it comes to people using words like snowflake and woke as a pejorative, as if talking about your feelings is a bad thing, or talking about your conditions is a bad thing. It's a consequence, because you can always muster up some sympathy for everybody if you try hard enough. It's a consequence of PE teacher culture or stiff upper lip syndrome. Young people taught from a very, very, very early age to ignore or batten down their own feelings. And so two things happen there. This is relevant to the conversation we were having about Kirsty Allsop. There's a subconscious bitterness and envy because you know that you carry pain, but you think that it's normal. You've convinced yourself it's normal to carry pain. The best indication of it is probably a very short temper. I was reading a lot of the details of the rioters who were being sent to prison yesterday. And again, it's not difficult to muster up some sympathy if you try hard enough. These are people who can't control their emotions. They're unregulated. They're easily manipulated, easily provoked. Someone whispers in their ear that the police are keeping the details of a killing of children from them, and their rage at the police can be almost immediately ignited. These are people carrying enormous pain as a consequence, in large part, of denying and silencing their own feelings, or having tough love at home, as you might call it, or being ignored by parents or told by their parents to man up or toughen up or pull their socks up, not unique, of course, to men. And what they grow up to be is angry and subconsciously envious. Why are we spending so much time talking about these young people's feelings? Bloody snowflakes, woke generation. What about all my rage that I never admit to, except when I'm saying sorry for exploding again to my own family? That's what you're dealing with when you've got people sending you messages trying to turn woke and snowflake into pejoratives, and showing them a little bit of love is not necessarily as hard as you might think. 10:54 is the time. Diane's in Hornchurch. Diane, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Diane.
I've got a lot to say. First of all, I think I'll start with, I had quite a dysfunctional childhood.
Yes.
So when I went to school, there was one particular teacher who, had I not ever been a part of her classes and stuff, I'm not sure I would be the person I am today. So I want to say that. But I also want to say that when I work with young people now, one of the first things I say to them is, I do the work I do because I now do a lot of youth work.
Yeah.
Because had I had someone like me back in the day, I would have done my life quite differently.
What a wonderful reason to do what you do, eh?
So, but I worked in education for 16 years as a learning mentor, and I came out of it because I was so disgruntled with it, because there's so much pressure put on these kids.
How do we describe the pressure in a way that helps older people understand how it's different from what they endured? That's a challenge I haven't always risen to.
Right, okay. So when we were younger, and I know we've touched on social media, but I'll just throw that in.
Yeah,
we never had social media. We never had the pressure of looking a certain way. We never had the pressure of being a certain type of person. They've got all
the time. We might have had it on Saturday evening at the roller disco, but we didn't have it 24/7, did we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I remember as a teenager when punk come along, and I absolutely grabbed hold of that with both hands, dyed my hair. My dad was like, "Oh my God," but it was almost my way of saying, "Listen to me."
Yes.
Like, I've got things to say as well, because it was that stiff British upper, we don't talk about that, and no, we mustn't discuss that, And to a certain extent, a lot of parenting nowadays has kind of still got a touch of that,
yes,
but in different ways.
Yes.
And I love working with, like, my field is teenagers, really, the ones that other people close the doors on, the ones that the other people don't want to work with. I want to work with these kids. I want to know the bigger picture. I want to know what's going on for you. Why did you constantly truant from school? Why did you self-harm? Why, because if we don't look at that, we're not gonna help these young people. They're up against, I've seen kids self-harm to an extent where they've had to be hospitalised because of the pressure of going into exam. That's wrong.
It just is, isn't it?
That's wrong. I've got 4 of my own children that I raised, and they've all done really well for themselves, not necessarily financially, but they've all followed their dreams, and I've supported that because I want my kids to be happy. I don't care if they're not financially secure. I want them to enjoy their life.
Be nice if they were, but if they're not going to, if it's not going to keep them awake at night, that's a win. I was thinking about this yesterday, in the sense that the things we never really say to children are things like, do you know you're a really easy person to talk to, or you're a really good friend, or you're a really nice.
Absolutely.
But I mean, these things are not valued, are they, in the environment you're describing?
Exactly, and I've done parenting groups, and I'll say to parents, we're quick to chastise and punish, but how often do we praise? And it might be the most simplest thing. It might be that, he remembered to put the milk back in the fridge. Did you say to him, "Oh, thanks for doing that, because the other day you left it out and I had to go and buy new"? Silly little things, because as much as people don't like to admit, or kids don't like to admit it, praise feels good. They might rubbish it, but deep down, we all like to be
calm down. Mine would say, "Calm down, Dad."
Get life, Dad. But can I just say this as well?
Of course you can.
I've got a grandson who's autistic, and I love this scenario, and I use it a lot in my work. It's called the Coke bottle scenario. So if you imagine a bottle of Coke being in a kid's pocket in school, and all through the day it's never opened, but it's shook up, it's bunged in their bag, bunged on the spot, and then when that child goes home, you take the lid off and the bottle just explodes. That's masking.
Yeah.
That's what, not necessarily autistic children, like you quite rightly said. It can be anybody who suffers with, worrying and anxiety and stuff. When you take that lid off, like I've seen kids that are so well behaved in school, and then I'll have a parent come in and say, "Oh, when he comes home, he does this and he does that," and I go, because he's had to. You are his safe place. When he comes home, that is where he can let it all out, and it. Unconditional love means sometimes we hurt the people that we love, but it's because they're allowed. And then you've got other parents who, sadly, because of poverty or holding down lots of jobs and things, they haven't got the time to sit with their kids, and it's just it's
so much. What gives you hope?
I have to have hope because I've got 2 grandchildren now who are coming up in the world, and I love my work. I absolutely.
People like you you'll be giving hope to a lot of people listening. Because as long as there's people like you out there doing what you do, things.
Yeah, I've had a lot of young people that I've worked with when they were sort of school age, and they've come back to me as an adult and said, like, "Oh, Diane, if we hadn't worked with you, I don't know. I don't think we'd got through school. I don't think this." And they're the little things that far surpasses any pay packet or.
We all like a bit of praise, Diane.
Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you. And thank you for everything you do. I don't know that there is a purer ambition. I suppose you could chalk it up as a sort of evolution of self-interest, but there are a few purer ambitions than wanting to be someone who would have had an incredibly beneficial impact upon your younger self if they'd encountered someone like you are now. That's beautiful. Thank you. It's 11:01.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 4 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's Thursday as well. I hope that doesn't come as a major shock to anybody, which means that all things being equal and sort of natural disasters notwithstanding, we will be diving into the delights of Mystery Hour after 12 noon today. But before that, we return to a mystery that has animated us during almost all of the time that we've spent together, perhaps more than anything else. And it's relevant in part to some of the conversation that we had in the last hour. It's probably, if you had to break every conversation we had down into its constituent parts, what are those dreadful things called that the pollsters do? Word clouds. Word clouds? If you had to break every single conversation we have, or every topic we discuss, down into its constituent parts, I think that class would probably pop up more than anything else. More definitely than race, because you can't really talk about race without talking about class. Of all the things, of all the little jigsaw pieces. So you take any topic that we talk about together as a completed jigsaw. I don't know why I'm running with this analogy. It's already tortured enough, but I hope it will. And then you smash up the completed jigsaw, and each little piece has got a name. The piece that would pop up most often in all the jigsaws that we assemble together, I think, would be class, and quite possibly working class issues. James Graham is currently one of my favourite people on the planet. He is a genius playwright. He's a really lovely bloke. He's a deep thinker, and perhaps most importantly, he creates absolutely banging content, dramas, plays, films, including one that is probably the most memorable play that I've seen in the last few years. Admittedly, it was about the newspaper industry, which is very close to my heart, but I don't know if you've seen Dear England. A portrait of the England footballer and team manager Gareth Southgate, which got a West End transfer. It's been turned into a TV drama series. He's done loads. If you don't know how much he's done, look him up or listen to the Full Disclosure interview that he gave about a month ago to me, which came out while I was on holiday, so I didn't get the opportunity to big it up quite as much as I would have done had I not been on holiday. The man is a legend, a genuine legend, and he is absolutely, inarguably working class. He grew up very near where 30p Lee grew up, actually, and went off in what you might describe as the polar opposite direction, except that his concern for fellow working class people is built on trying to improve their lives as opposed to trying to encourage them to hate other people who are underprivileged or vulnerable but a slightly different colour or from a slightly different ethnicity. I want you to approach this, perhaps not entirely from the perspective of the television industry, because most of us aren't really qualified to talk specifically about the television industry. But what he's done in the McTaggart Lecture, which is the big industry address at the Edinburgh Television Festival every year, I'll give you an idea of how prestigious it is. Mateless did it a couple of years ago. You got to be huge to do the McTaggart Lecture, and James Graham gives it this year, and he uses it to draw attention to, among other things, but the bit that intrigues me most, to draw attention to the absence of working class representation in his industry, which I could pretty easily essay into my industry, and you could almost certainly translate it into your industry. If it is a traditional profession or a more highly paid role, then it is not one that is going to be well represented or is going to see high representation of working class people. Now, the traditional definition of working class in this kind of conversation would be determined by the professional status of your parents. And that's really interesting, because you might think of yourself as working class even though you're earning £500,000 a year and flying your own helicopter around the home counties. And you would be perfectly entitled to, because class is not about where you are, it's about where you come from. It seems odd, really, to think of it that way round, because our natural instincts are to see it differently. Our natural instincts are to see success as being class progress or class movement. But James Graham puts this really, really well. He says it's not just about money. You do not stop being working class the second you get a pay rise, nor do you become working class the instant you might drop below a certain level. So it's about a lot more, in a way, than status. It's different from status. Your status and your class can be two very different things. There is migration between classes, but nowhere near as much as there used to be. The reason why television programs for listeners of a certain age, like Keeping Up Appearances, featuring the inimitable Hyacinth Bucket, are so powerful, are so popular in this country, is because they speak to truths and realities that we all know. The social climber. But it's not about status, it's about something else. And I will never stop being fascinated by what it is actually about. He talks about it being hard to measure. It's much easier to define areas of diversity, such as racial representation. And the quote he uses is, that can fire up the activist in us. So I show you someone who is being discriminated against or held back because of their ethnicity, because of their minority ethnicity. Minority is crucial. And I can fire you up. Not everybody, but generally speaking, it's visible, it's easy to see, it's minority status, and it's unfair. So the unfairness becomes incredibly easy to convey. It's not easy necessarily with class issues. It's harder to pin down, it's harder to measure. It's harder to define that particular area of diversity. And that's why it's so easy for people who do not give a monkeys about the welfare of the working class to pretend that they do, while they are fomenting racism or encouraging attacks upon the police, many of whom, of course, will be working class men and women. Because it's hard to define, it's easy to ill-define or wrongly define in pursuit of your own agenda, whether it is, clicks on social media or attention on the political stage. So that's a sad development that we've lived with recently. That's why I mentioned the fact that James Graham grew up in the same sort of mining communities that 30p Lee Anderson grew up in, because you can see the two directions that you can go in when it comes to representing working class culture. You can either provide passionate expositions of it, or you can pretend that the plight of the working class man and woman in the United Kingdom is somehow a consequence of people from other backgrounds, other ethnicities receiving unfair preferential treatment. So how do you do it? How do you do it? We've talked about this a lot, But what I want to pin down today is the bit that you can't change, right? Not the bits that you can change, like your income, or even your accent, or even your social circle. But the bits that you can't change. I think I don't know that this one's going to work, you know, because normally at this point I'd have a couple of ideas bubbling in the back of my head about what you might say to me. I can't think of anything. Parental contacts. So I got my first job in newspapers. I got my first break in newspapers by selling a suit to John Major. Because my father was a newspaper journalist, people like to claim that it was a consequence of nepotism or that it was a consequence of unfairness. And I used to bridle at that. But of course, when I walked into the newspaper office where I'd got a shift because I sold a suit to John Major while working in menswear, I had huge advantages. There were people in that newspaper office who knew my dad. My dad hadn't got me the shift, but I had huge advantages because of his professional status. So, I mean, it's not nepotism in the sense that I only got the job because I got 2 shifts on the Daily Express gossip column. It was up to me what I did with them, but I wouldn't have possibly done what I did with them if it wasn't for the soft privilege that I had by being able to say to the assistant news editor, I think you knew my father. And then, of course, there were people I'd been to school with in that office, the old school type. So the things that you can't change, and crucially, I want you to, and we're talking about class, not race, to be clear. Obviously, you can't change your race, but the whole point of this conversation is to find the common ground between the two diversities. So it's very easy to define race. It's very hard to define class in the context of the things that you can't change. And and the way in which I want you to do it is by telling me about the moments you realised that. The moments you realised the things you couldn't change. If you like, the characteristics of being working class that you kind of hadn't clocked until you got ambushed by them. The things you can't change. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's coming up to 11:15. I mean, the subtext, the important subtext of all of this, the purpose, I beg your pardon, of all of this is atrocious representation of working class people in the television industry in the first instance. The figures are actually obscene. The percentages of people, it's like single figure representation. The number of people in the television industry considered to be working class stands currently at about 8%. Middle and upper class is the highest it's been in 10 years, standing at about 60%. But you can't really have a meaningful conversation about this if you don't know what the words mean. And I still don't really know what they mean, which is why James Graham, who as one of the finest writers of his generation, it's fair to say, has a bit of a way with words. It's why he's opened a door I hadn't noticed before. And it's not just about money. It's not just about your parents' jobs. It's not just about the way that you speak or the way that you dress. There's something here. There are things here that are either impossible or incredibly hard to change. And unless you are carrying them into the workplace or the world, you probably don't know what that's like. Let's try and find out. Okay, what are the things, what are the immutable characteristics? That's a great phrase. What are the immutable characteristics of a working class background? I'm really worried about this one. But you usually come through for me. 0345 6060 973. The immutable characteristics of a working class background. Let's see how we get on with this. It's 11:15.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:15 is the time. The immutable characteristics of the working class. And, you know, just in the interests of nuance, definitions and words, I don't normally do this, but there are 2 fighting age migrants who've just been accused of grooming underage girls, sex with a minor, and also human trafficking. Some people often claim that I ignore this sort of thing on the programme and then fail to provide any evidence to support these claims. But on this occasion, I am prepared to report 2 fighting-age migrants have been accused in the last 24 hours of grooming underage girls, sex with a minor and trafficking. So I presume that the usual suspects, Yaxley Lennon, Farage and the rest of them, will soon be coming out in very, very, very strong condemnation of Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan. 11:15 is the time. What are the immutable characteristics of the British working class? Charlie's in Hackney. Charlie, what do you reckon?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to say I'm a university lecturer just about to retire. I was born working class, and I took advantage of all the free education.
Will you die working class?
Well, this is what I'm about to say. Well, this is it. I don't think I'll change from being working class. I think I'll always be working class.
Sure.
But I took advantage of what my parents and grandparents got for working class people to have a free education.
Yeah.
I became a lecturer at a university. And there's something called a double unbelonging, where you end up at a certain point in your life where you've lost communication with your working class roots.
Yes.
You're not included in the party of the academic middle class. So you get to a certain point in your life where they call it a double unbelonging. And Annie Ernaux, that
a double unbelonging.
Yeah. So you get to that point later in life.
Like being mixed race in a way.
Well, it's
Perhaps.
just like you don't belong anywhere, at that point.
I've heard that description, not that word, but I've heard that description applied to ethnic and racial experiences as well. So what are the immutable characteristics that hold you back from making the transition, as it were, the full transition?
Well, apart from anything else, there's accent discrimination, which is still evident, and it's evident. But
you can change your accent. I know you shouldn't, and you wouldn't want to, but you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can become invisible, if so. But by becoming invisible, you're sort of becoming that middle-class person, but you're never included into that. And I don't want to change my accent or my social identity just in order to be able to do a job that I'm now qualified to do, is what I'm talking about. And I don't see why I should, really.
No. Well, there's going to be a million different answers to this question, isn't there?
Yeah.
So you are conscious of, I call it the glass door, if you like, that you can't get through. And then the other door has shut behind you and you can't get back. But you don't particularly want to. You want to live in a world where there aren't any doors.
Absolutely. And also, I had free education as a result of wars and social movement and all sorts of things. To be able to have that, do I say mobility? Maybe I don't. Maybe it's just equality. But you will find later on that you're excluded from both, including your parent culture, because of where you've moved to, or maybe your accent changes, like you just said.
Yeah. Did you ever think about that? Did you ever think about trying to sound a bit more kind of estuarine?
Oh, I did RP? In certain times. I had to in certain situations change my accent.
And is it as bad now as it was when you were younger? Because
it's been right the way through. It's endemic.
But it hasn't gone up or down. It's just a solid. If you talk like
the students that I teach tend to be of a different accent class. And so that's kind of it. That's to show that free education is now over, and only certain students have access to that.
No, I don't know that. Statistically, there's more people in tertiary education than ever before, Charlie.
Yeah, but when I went to school, when I went to college, I didn't pay for education. No. Kids are getting into debt now.
They're
getting into student loans.
A slightly different conversation. I'm just talking about the access has increased, not decreased. Yeah. I think it's important to chalk that up. Final question. What are the presumptions or the prejudices that you think people carry towards your accent, which is the most obvious signifier of your class?
I think that I lived in the United States for a while. It didn't exist.
Right.
And I know that they've got different class delineations, and that in the United States a lot is based on colour and lots of other things. But it doesn't exist in other countries. It does still exist in the UK.
And what does it denote, though, to the people?
Well, it denotes whether they take you seriously, whether you get the job, whether you're accepted onto the course, whether you get funding. I lost funding for a master's course because I was told by the governing body to go and check where people on my course did their first degrees, and since it was mainly Oxford and Cambridge, they were the ones who got the funding and I didn't. That was just one situation.
No, and so, one of many. No one is disputing that it's there, or the difficulty sometimes of pinning it down in substantive terms rather than subjective terms, rather than the personal experience that is clearly true, but doesn't necessarily feed into a kind of academic definition of what these immutable characteristics are. Because by definition, accent is not immutable. It's a bit of a pet subject of mine, but there is no earthly way that Jacob Rees-'s Pieces speaks the way that he does organically. You know, Ian Duncan Donuts, the same. It took a decision at some point to try to sound posh, in the same way that many of my generation, my cohort of public school boys, took a decision in about 1986, 1987 to try to sound a bit less posh. I don't know why. It's just the way the cookie crumbled. But accent is therefore not immutable, and because accent is not immutable, the real sort of the real tragic snobs of the 1950s and 60s started trying to define the words that would denote your class, even if you sounded proper. Even if you sounded upper class or middle class, they made a list of words. There was an academic at Birmingham University in conjunction, I think, this is one of their moments when I have no idea where in my memory this is filed. Was it one of the Mitford sisters? And an academic at Birmingham University made a list of words that would denote that you were from the lower orders, even if you sounded like you weren't. They called it you and non-you. So if you said toilet instead of lavatory, I presume, or, I don't know, bog, you said toilet or settee, lounge. There's all sorts of words that would somehow act as code. And then there's pronunciation as well. There's the weird words that the posh people pronounce in entirely absurd ways, utterly unphonetically, in order to sort of keep out the lower orders or provide a sort of indication to each other. So accent is mutable. What are the immutable characteristics of a working class background? 0345 6060 973. It's 11:15. I think my clock stopped. It's 11:26. My clock stopped at 11:15 and I've only just noticed. Let me just have a quick chat with my colleagues. Have I missed a break already? What time is it now? 11:26. So I'll carry on talking, shall I? Okay. I will go to a call. It's all right. I'm not completely useless. Craig's in Newcastle. Craig, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
What time have you got, Craig?
You're asking me now because I'm not looking at the right screen on my phone.
No, nor was I, it turns out. I've got 11:26. That'll do. 11:27. What was on your mind?
I originally called up to talk about representation of working classes in the arts.
Yes.
And your producer asked me about this immutable question. I mustn't have been listening properly, and I do apologise for that.
You talk about whatever you want to talk about. Tell me whatever you want to tell me.
The two things are sort of connected in my mind.
Yes.
The possible immutable characteristic of being working class. I grew up in a working class town in Northumberland and went to a state comprehensive in a very economically deprived area.
Yes.
And I think one of the immutable characteristics isn't necessarily something that comes from within being working class, but something that comes from without, and that's this notion of some areas of life are just not your natural habitat.
Yeah.
And I think that with the
like being an actor.
So my story is I acted all through in school plays and what have you, and loved that and enjoyed that. But anything outside of that, the idea of being an actor, of becoming a professional actor, was it was never mooted. It was never put forward as hey, if you like to do this, these are the ways you can do it. You can go here. You can join amateur theatre groups. Drama school was something that I didn't even really know existed, and later in life, when I was 29, I joined an amateur theatre group just to get back into it,
right?
And through that, discovered that hey, I can actually do this, and I ended up working professionally as an actor for about 5 years until COVID shut all of the theatres down.
Sorry.
And it's all right. Sure. I had a young child by that point, and my priorities had changed, and and what.
But this is, I mean, where's the immutable characteristic though? Because opportunity clearly, and I'd use the word vocabulary to just know that that's an option. You go to a school like mine and say you want to be an actor. You can go to a school like mine and say you want to be Prime Minister. It's a perfectly reasonable ambition, but it's not. I don't know where the immutable characteristic comes in here.
So the example I used is like I say, it was never the idea of going into certain professions, particularly the arts. Is something that I don't feel in my experience, and certainly in the experience of other state school graduates that I know of, was ever anything that was even slightly put forward.
But even if you make it, it's still extraordinary, rather than a natural progression into a career that you'd always fancied. Instead, it becomes almost magic wand territory.
Yeah, and there is a private school in Newcastle that for their end of year show, they used to hire out the largest stage, like Northern Stage in Newcastle, which is one of the largest stages in Europe, to put their end of year show on.
To put the school play on, as it were, the school show.
And whilst I'm certainly not saying, they shouldn't be allowed to do that, I have opinions on private schools, but I'm not saying that. What I am saying is the difference from a class perspective and going, you can do this if you want to, just go and do it.
Expectation, entitlement versus what you're describing.
Working class. And I think that is something that is built in to people from a certain upbringing of that. The immutable characteristic, I would say, is
whatever the absence of entitlement is.
Yeah, well, it's just this idea of never even knowing that is something that people can do, and we talk about underrepresentation of working classes in the arts, and I think that is a massive part of it because people don't.
You can't be what you can't be what you can't see.
Yeah, so obviously there are exceptions that prove the rule. But those are few and far between, and
they are extraordinary rather than ordinary. Whereas increasingly, for people from a private school education to have gone into acting or TV in general or whatever it may be, that is ordinary as opposed to extraordinary, unexceptional as opposed to exceptional. Craig, that's brilliant. Thank you. What is the word then that we use as a corollary for entitlement? So an immutable working class characteristic is the opposite of whatever entitlement is. And I don't know what word to use, but you will. You'll come up with something. Thomas Watts is here now with the headline.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:34 is the time. The opposite of entitlement, says Andrew, is imposter syndrome. Any working class person who achieves promotion will feel it on occasion. And yet... So that's what I was going to reach for, actually. I was going to reach for imposter syndrome as being the opposite of entitlement. I talked to Neil Basu a bit about imposter syndrome in this week's Full Disclosure. And yet, I can tell you now, almost everyone suffers from imposter syndrome. High-achieving middle-class people, high-achieving upper-class people, everyone. I think Neil told me the statistic is something like 70% of the population will suffer from imposter syndrome. It's like you're waiting for the tap on the shoulder to tell you that you're having a laugh. All right, yeah, all right, back to, what would it be for me? Back to measuring inside legs. You've had your fun. I think almost everybody suffers from that. And in some ways, I've often thought that the only people who don't suffer from a form of imposter syndrome are sociopaths. You're capable of imagining different universes, different paths, different lives for yourself. You will have a form of imposter syndrome. Maybe not forever. Maybe you grow out of it. I think that Alan's got a better word than imposter syndrome. But is this an immutable working class characteristic? Unworthiness. It's not for the likes of us. That's one of the phrases I hate most in the English language. Know your place, and it's not for the likes of us. I thought everyone was raised like me and my sister were raised, to believe the opposite of those things. It's only when I started doing this job in some ways that I realised some people really not only have had know your place drilled into them from a very early age, but it has, of course, transmogrified into forelock tugging and cap doffing, often entirely undeserving and unworthy individuals who just sound like they've got a couple of conkers in their mouth. Unworthiness. Oh, I hope that's not a word that works as an opposite of entitlement, but I've got a horrible feeling it is. Back to the phones. Cab's in Cambridge. Cab, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. We haven't talked about class before. You've read a couple of my tweets out about class. You read them out in a way that sounded like you've been really chastised, and I just want to tell you weren't being.
Okay,
so
thank you for
not where I was coming from. I get what people are saying about imposter syndrome, but I want to just put it a different way.
Yeah.
I came from a sink of state and Gateshead. I did a degree at a lesser university and a PhD at a better university. Then I ended up working at the best university in the world in Cambridge.
Yes.
And that means you're mixing with Etonians and people from what are considered to be the best schools and the best backgrounds. And it's not my imposter syndrome. Everyone's got that. It's not that I have doubts. It's that they don't.
Yes.
It's that they have this attitude of not doubting themselves when they've got an idea. And they don't go through the same internal steps of verifying an idea and proving an idea that you do if you're brought up without that constant reassurance that you're always right.
Oh, you're
and that
absolutely
is such a profound difference in how you're treated when you're putting your ideas forward, when you have not a sense of doubt, but a need to prove it. And they're putting their ideas forward, and they don't.
And it's subconscious in terms of the reaction to it is subconscious.
Of course it is. When they put their ideas forward with absolute confidence, then you believe them. But it goes further than that. I mean, I was sitting in a talk given
What's
by
your
an
field,
engineering
Cab?
professor.
What's your field, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm a microbiologist, a fermentation microbiologist. We've talked in the past about
Yes,
vaccines
that's
and the
right,
like.
I remember. Yeah, go on.
I sat in a talk given by an engineering professor years ago, and he'd come up with this really clever solution to a problem, and it seemed very, very good. And he was presenting to an international investor, and it was all very, very nice. And he presented with the verification that he was right, that he'd given the project to his students, and they'd come up with the same engineering solution. So he's a public school in Oxford educated chap, teaching a bunch of other public school and Oxbridge educated, mostly chaps. And they've got the same answers as him, so it's right.
Yes.
And nobody in the room questions it. Nobody in the room says, hang on a minute, do you not think maybe getting some ideas from further afield or some different perspectives might lead you to a different solution? And it's like I'm living in crazy land and no one else sees it at that moment. just maybe there are other approaches and maybe there are other perspectives that might give you a different engineering solution. But even I'm kind of gobby, but even I don't kind of dare stand up and ask that question at that point, because I'm in a room full of people who are not going to get it. And that, I think, is the key part. It's not that
you're in a room you're in a room full of people who, through no fault of their own, never question their right to be in that room.
Yeah, basically.
Whereas an immutable characteristic of a working class background would be questioning whether you have the right to be in that room. Now, your answer to that question might be, hell yes, I do. But you're still asking it, and that's the immutability. It's
not my lack of self-worth or my questioning my value to be there. It's their lack of doing so, which is the key difference.
No, but their lack of doing so only becomes pertinent if you are doing so.
How do I put it again?
No, don't say. I mean, my degree is in philosophy. Yours is in biochemistry. So you meet me halfway on this.
maybe that is the way of putting it. But I would. Well,
it must be, because if their condition is an absence, yours must be a presence.
I guess in strict physics, yes. I guess yes.
Do you know what Sophie said?
Yeah, it's another way of looking at it.
Do you know what Sophie says? Sophie says, so your caller is describing men, James, and but you know she's kind of right as well, because the confidence with which men say things is part of the same condition that you describe, but in different contexts. When people when women ring into the programme, they often begin by apologising because the quality of their contribution isn't going to be very good, and of course it always is, often much better than the contributions of the men who ring in and think that they should be doing my job.
This is clearly far more common amongst men, but if you find yourself mixing with public school educated women, then you find that does slant it in a different direction too. But she's kind of right, yeah.
So what was the single word we would use then as the opposite of entitled? We haven't got one, have we yet?
I don't have a word, but it's like they're inoculated against understanding of Dunning-Kruger effect, and we're not.
Yeah, I recognise that, and I am. Despite having forms of imposter syndrome over the years, I'm very much on the other side of the room from Cab on that one, entirely as a consequence of my education. entirely as a consequence of my education. I am the bloke who can speak with absolute confidence and certainty to a degree where people will believe me more than they would if my manner was different. The consequence of my schooling was different. And that is why you end up with someone like Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister. Imagine if your only experience of Boris Johnson was on paper. Imagine if we were a non-vocal society. We communicated entirely through vision. And everything that we knew about Boris Johnson was communicated to us through prose on paper or on a screen. You would probably not let him near scissors. Such would be the evidence of his utter absurdity and inadequacy. Boris Johnson is 100% manner. He is 100% attitude, bluster, swagger, 110%. And that is, and he can end up Prime Minister of this country as a consequence of what Cab describes. Standing up in a room, talking undiluted gibberish in such a convincing fashion that he can end up Prime Minister of these islands and win a general election. It's not self-doubt. It's not just doubt. It's subtler than that. It's more nuanced than that. But doubt comes closer, perhaps, than some of the other words that we've been bandying around. Cab, thank you for that. Isabel's in Broadstairs. Isabel, what would you like to say?
Hi, I've listened to you a lot of times, and I really love listening to you.
Thank you.
I'm very nervous.
Oh, it's only me, but thank you.
I'm definitely working class. I come from the northwest of England, from a working town. I got a degree and I got myself into teaching. And basically, I had to prove myself time and time and time again. And your last caller had it right.
Yes.
We, as working class people, we have to prove ourselves more than people who maybe went to private school.
To whom?
To whoever we're working with, to people outside.
You think you do?
Well, I do.
But you do. You do.
Yeah. I've definitely got imposter syndrome because now my accent has changed a lot. There's still elements of north in there.
Yes.
But when I go up north, I'm terribly posh.
Right, yes.
And people look at me and go, oh, well, you're from down there, aren't you? And I go, no, originally I'm from here. But I know a lot of people, it's like being northern. I've come out of the north, but you'll never take the north out of me. You'll never take the working class out of me, because I will always be part of that community. But I wanted to prove myself to people. I wanted to show them I can do just as well as you.
And the.
I'll tell you a little story. When
Please.
I first came for my interview for my teaching job in Kent, the chair of governors who interviewed me was a lovely man. However, he'd fought in World War II from Manston Airport in the RAF and talked terribly, terribly like this.
Yes.
And he said to me, we want to give you the job, but we're very concerned the children here won't understand you. So I said, OK, I'll go away and work on it. And when I eventually got down, in the first week or first couple of weeks, a child said to me, "Here, miss, I ain't got one in it." And I said, "I'm sorry.
I beg your pardon?
Sorry, I don't understand you." Yeah, and when we used to do SATs, because I taught infants at Key Stage Year 2, when they used to do SAT, one of the words was bath, or, to me, bath.
But you said class when you came on.
As in?
You said you were working class when you came on. No, but you didn't say working class.
No, because now I've changed my accent.
Yeah, in the course of this call.
I'm very sorry.
No, I do. I used to do it all the time.
Yeah,
I still do a bit.
You do it because you feel like you're not as good as other people.
Well, there's two reasons for it. On a class basis, there's a psychological term for it. It's about putting the person you're talking to at their ease, actually. It's like mirroring. Absolutely. Mirroring, it can be called sometimes. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about mirroring. It's not immutable. I know I keep hitting this. In many ways, accent is not immutable. Otherwise, no one would know that David Tennant is Scottish. He can play English. He could,
absolutely. And I can put on the accent if I need to.
Yeah, so can I.
I think you need to prove yourself as a working class person much more than people who've
justify yourself more than prove. You need to justify your presence in the room where it happens. Whereas,
as your last caller said,
and that it doesn't matter what you've achieved. This is bringing us back to James Graham. It doesn't matter how much you earn or how much you've achieved or what your status is. It doesn't change that sense of needing to justify or having to or being required to justify. And listen, this is hundreds of years of social conditioning, very deliberate, albeit that it's not literally taught on blackboards. Keeping the lower orders in their place is the only way we could have had a monarchy for the last 1,500 years or however many years. I mean, literally no way that some inbred imbecile can become an earl unless all of the people infinitely cleverer than the inbred imbecile have been somehow persuaded that he is better than them. It's probably why this country's never had a proper revolution. And when it did, about 14 years later, they turned around and put the dead king's son back on the same bloody throne.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:51, and attendant on this conversation, just a nod towards Kirsty Allsop's Twitter account, which informed some of the conversation we had yesterday in the last hour about anxiety among children. And actually, I think inevitably, because I think her dad's an aristocrat, isn't he? There's probably some class involved in this as well. But the decision to let her 15-year-old boy go travelling on continental Europe with a 16-year-old friend continues to bubble away. She's tweeted this morning, "Congratulations to the Sun for having the most negative take on teen travel and totally failing to report any of the amazing life-affirming positive tweets you've sent me. No wonder so many people are living in fear when a national newspaper behaves so bizarrely." I missed that. She's good, isn't she? So, an endemic of anxiety, not just among young people, but also among adults, could perhaps have been contributed to by a commercial media that dedicates its entire existence to trying to frighten you. Look out, some immigrants, single mothers, unemployed people. Everything is designed to frighten you. And we sit here going, why are we all so anxious? And you'll turn on LBC at a slightly different time of day, and someone will be telling you to fear everybody who doesn't look exactly like you. Funny old world, isn't it? Back to class. Christopher's in Belfast. Christopher, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, James, it's nice to speak to you again. This is an area that I've published on, researched on.
I remember. And more importantly than any of your academic accolades and publications, you've also phoned this programme before on similar territory.
Exactly. The one thing I wanted to highlight to you is this brilliant English social historian, the most famous one ever, E.P. Thompson, explained a lot of this really, really well, where he said that class is not an it. It's moving, it's relational, it's immaterial, but it's real. And the way he explains that it's immaterial, but it's real is so good, because he says it's like having love. You don't have love without lovers. You don't have deference without lords and peasants. And the last thing he says about it is that class is not the machine itself. Class is the smell, the noise, the feeling the machine gives off when you're around it. And that's what kind of, I think, encapsulates what a lot of your callers have said about that imposter syndrome, the language, the scapegoating, all the
noticing, the fact that you don't notice or you do. So somebody from my class doesn't notice what somebody working class notices in the same environment, in the same room, in the same moment.
No, exactly. And that's where I've noticed that from teaching lots of working class students throughout, a few decades now, that they will be more reticent in the classroom, and you actually have to encourage them a lot more so that they become comfortable of expressing themselves. And you can see how they develop through whenever you're teaching them actually, and through their learning, how they kind of grow in stature actually, and how they begin to understand all those kind of ways of using language that other people who have better education or better education opportunities have gone to better schools that they imbibe naturally.
There's another element of this conversation, the difference between education and intelligence.
Oh, yeah, no, exactly. And that's where a previous caller said about Cambridge and Oxford being the best universities. I don't know. I think in knowledge terms, they're probably the best. But in intelligence terms, I'm not convinced about that.
No, of course not.
many other people from other universities, from Russell Group and non-Russell Group, who are just as good, just as intelligent, or better and have more intelligence than the people from Oxbridge. But that's part of the kind of English class system.
Yes,
in that
of course it is. It's all about hierarchies, isn't it? Not necessarily obviously at first glance a class-based hierarchy, but scratch the surface of it and that's what you'll find. Any hierarchy is going to have a very intimate relationship with class.
Exactly, and that's the kind of last point I would make about that, is that class is really about unequal power relationships, I think.
Yeah.
That it's who has access to the power and doesn't. And those who are like myself from middle class backgrounds, we get access to that power much more easily. We get imbibed into it or drawn into it much more easily than other classes and other groups in society. And that's why it's the way the education system is run across the UK and Ireland now, in terms of money being so important. It is criminal to do that. Exactly.
You never break out of that cycle for as long as it exists. Do you want to mention anything? Any of your work that people might want to read?
No. I've taken far too much time already.
You're just going to stick with the E.P. Thompson. Which E.P. Thompson would you go? I've read his William Blake book, which I think was published after he died, but I haven't read anything else. Where should we start with our E.P. Thompson studies?
The Making of the English Working Class.
What a title.
Because you'll read stuff about the Newcastle and Durham miners and about them breaking into mine owners' houses and leaving notes for the mine owners saying about how they drank all their wine and they were glad they did. It's just full of so many brilliant things. It really, reading that book 10, 15 years ago really made me look at the English working class in a totally different fashion and manner. It's such a good book and such a great kind of homage to English working people and what they've done throughout centuries. But thank you for your time again, James.
Thank you for your time, and you could have taken longer if you wanted. Interesting. I just saw a clip yesterday of Jacob Rees-Pieces recording himself explaining why trade union members shouldn't have got the pay rises that they've received. I don't know why that popped into my mind then when Christopher was talking, but it's of a piece, isn't it, with much of what we've been discussing. I think his maternal grandfather, by the way, was a lorry driver. Rees-Pieces, not Christopher. So, what is immutable and what is not is a much deeper question than perhaps we realised when we first asked it. Mark's in Dunfermline. Mark, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you doing?
I'm good, mate. What's on your mind?
Just on this subject, I think as some of your previous calls have been really, really good in what they've said. One thing for me that we all, as if you've ever been working class and you've managed to kind of drag yourself up a wee bit, is you've got this fear. There's always a fear in the back of your head that if the cards fall differently, you could be back there. And you don't have this kind of support network that upper class, middle class people might have grew up with in their family. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just making some slightly annoying noises there, Mark, to be honest with you. But you were right to identify the fact that they were perhaps a precursor to a more articulate contribution. I don't know that I agree with you, and I can't really argue with you because you're speaking from personal experience, and it's a personal experience I don't have. But I know that there are people who were born posh who haven't got a pot to pee in and haven't got the structure that you describe. And so they wouldn't be working class, but they would have the feeling. Martin Amis used to call it tramp angst. And it didn't matter how many best-selling books he wrote or how much money he had in the bank. He was animated by a constant fear that he was going to end up with nothing.
That's exactly how I feel, or exactly how I would put it. But what I would say is that what we don't have, or what I don't have, and what my wife doesn't have, as people who grew up in kind of working class families living from paycheck to paycheck, we don't have any family members. If we fell on hard times, there's no one we can go and ask for help. We would be pretty much
not enough. I mean, you might sofa surf or something like that, or a friend might put you up for a couple of weeks. But
there's no one I can go and ask.
But that's status. That's not class.
Well, I would. But where does the line? Where's the line?
I don't know. That's tomorrow's phone in.
I don't know if it is status. I think that is class, because you're more likely to be in that position if you're working class than you would be if you're upper class.
You're highly unlikely to have a friend who has an empty cottage on their estate that you can borrow for a couple of years if you're working class. But equally, there will be people who grew up in incredibly moneyed circumstances who can end up without anybody to turn to. But yeah, you're closer to it than I am. But I think it's 52% class, 48% status. It's 11:59. Thank you, Mark. What an interesting phone. Thank you. I was worried about that one. Because it was quite a weird one. Immutable characteristic. What are the immutable characteristics? I could write an E.P. Thompson thesis. What are the immutable characteristics of the working class condition in post-Brexit Britain? Or pre-Brexit Britain. I just wanted to make the title sound a bit fancier than it did before. We'll come back to that. That's great stuff. I might give old James Graham a ring, actually, and see what his thoughts are on the subject of the immutable characteristics. Great word. That's it, though, for this part of the programme. Time next for Mystery Hour, your weekly opportunity to achieve the sort of satisfaction not ordinarily available anywhere else on your radio dial. And if you want to get a question on the board, well, forgive me, but you'd better get your skates on.
James O'Brien on LBC.